When people talk about the most intimidating figures in professional wrestling, Sid Eudy's name almost always surfaces. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, wore an intense scowl, and pummeled rivals with raw power. Although he earned major championships in both WWE and WCW, something about his career always felt different. He didn't worship wrestling like so many others did. Instead, he approached it as a simple means to earn a living. Over the years, he soared to main events, had runs cut short by controversies, and even shattered his leg in one of the most horrifying injuries ever televised. By the end of his life, he had become a giant in both physicality and persona. Yet somehow, he remained on the outside looking in at the WWE Hall of Fame. This is the story of Sid Eudy, told in a simpler style but capturing every twist and turn that made him unforgettable. Let's go on a journey into the mind and career of the man they called Sid Justice, Sid Vicious, and Sycho Sid. Sidney Raymond Eudy was born on December 16, 1960, in a small town nestled in the rural areas of Arkansas. Many professional wrestlers grew up watching televised matches and collecting action figures. Sid was different. Long before wrestling crossed his mind, he was hauling bales of hay, cleaning out stalls, and doing odd jobs on a family farm. His daily tasks turned him into a naturally muscular teenager with a broad back and powerful arms attributes that would one day translate into ring dominance. It's easy to picture him at dawn, stumbling out of bed to feed animals before trudging off to school. By the time the sun set, he was back for another round of farm chores. That daily grind felt routine. Sid would later admit that he never spent much time following weight training programs in the early days. His gym was simply the farm. In an industry where many icons were enthralled by wrestling from birth, Sid never really cared about it growing up. By his late teens, he was still uninterested, focused more on life's immediate tasks, making a bit of money, supporting himself, and figuring out the future. The ring didn't intrigue him, and the bright lights of wrestling arenas were a world away. Fate, however, has a way of knocking on unsuspecting doors. You won't believe how a chance encounter in a gym changed everything, especially for someone who'd never even watched a match. Sid's entry into wrestling came without the usual childhood dreams. The most popular version of the story says that Sid was training in a local gym, minding his own business, when Randy Macho Man Savage, dressed in flamboyant attire, noticed him. Savage took one look at this mountainous man and asked if he'd ever considered professional wrestling. According to this telling, Sid brushed off the idea at first, but eventually realized it could pay better than his other options, especially with a child on the way. On the other side, Lanny Poffo, Randy Savage's brother, offers a contradictory account. He insists that Sid showed up at a Memphis wrestling event, introduced himself, and asked how to break into the sport. Which story is accurate? No one can say for sure. But one fact remains. Sid was motivated by money. When his wife became pregnant, he needed a reliable income. And if that came from wearing trunks and boots, so be it. He wasn't like Bret Hart or Shawn Michaels, who had idolized the business all their lives. He never pored over magazines or taped old matches. Sid was pragmatic. For him, the ring was a job, not a lifelong dream. That mindset actually helped him later. While other wrestlers got caught up in the romance of the industry, Sid saw it strictly as a business arrangement. Wrestle, get paid, move on. Sid's early forays into wrestling landed him in places like Continental Championship Wrestling. Anyone who caught a glimpse of his earliest televised matches would have seen a tall rookie figuring things out. But the promoters had a brilliant idea: hide his inexperience behind a gimmick. That's how he became Lord Humongous, a persona ripped straight out of the post-apocalyptic film Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior. He wore a hockey mask, leather gear, and carried a menacing chain. The gimmick worked wonders. By masking his face, promoters gave Sid room to stumble without tarnishing his real identity. Fans didn't expect a refined performance from a masked brute with a terrifying name. They wanted to see destruction. Even back then, though, one thing was clear. Sid didn't just look big, he felt big. His presence was enormous, and people at ringside cringed when he dished out simple but devastating strikes. This early period let Sid learn the ropes away from mainstream scrutiny. He could hone his craft in front of smaller crowds. It was the perfect setup. The audience accepted his basic power moves because of the character, and behind the scenes, he picked up vital lessons from veteran wrestlers. In addition to his run as Lord Humongous, Sid spent time in Japan, wrestling under the name Vicious Warrior. New Japan Pro Wrestling, which had a reputation for a stiffer wrestling style, took an interest in him. They envisioned him as the next Bruiser Brody, a larger-than-life brawler who had a huge following in Japan. Brody was revered for his intense style and unpredictable nature. Sid attempted to channel that aura, although he still had a way to go in terms of skill. Those Japanese tours toughened him up. Matches in Japan were known for heavier strikes. When Sid returned to the States, he came back with more grit and an appreciation for the psychology of wrestling. He learned how to make a few moves look impactful rather than try to be a flashy technical wizard. While his ring name shifted between Lord Humongous, Vicious Warrior, and eventually Sid Vicious, the underlying qualities stayed consistent: intimidation, raw power, and enough presence to fill any venue. Soon, bigger stages came calling, and Sid was ready to move on. By 1989, Sid stepped into World Championship Wrestling, WCW, as part of a tag team called the Skyscrapers, alongside Dan Spivey. It was a promoter's dream. Two towering wrestlers, each close to 7 feet tall, tossing opponents around with ease. They wore matching black ring gear and carried an aura of unrelenting force. Commentators boasted about their near 14-foot combined height, thrilling fans and giving jobber opponents nightmares. They used matches against lower-level talent to show off their dominance. Week after week, fans saw them dismantle opponents with fierce power bombs and clotheslines. This quick push put them on the path to tag team success. However, during a match against the Steiner brothers at a Clash of the Champions event, Sid suffered serious injuries, a broken rib and a punctured lung. WCW was forced to pause the Skyscrapers' trajectory. While recovering, Sid apparently stirred resentment backstage. There was a rumor that he was caught playing softball while claiming to be injured, something old-school wrestling veterans considered disrespectful. Once Sid returned, some in management used it as an excuse to teach him a lesson. He was fed to Lex Luger in a 26-second squash. For a giant who was once unstoppable, that was a humiliating setback. But Sid's raw potential was hard to ignore, and higher-ups eventually found new ways to keep him in the spotlight. Imagine getting invited to join wrestling's most elite group, but you're already eyeing the exit door. In one of wrestling's biggest surprises, Sid was welcomed into the Four Horsemen in 1990. Led by Ric Flair, this stable was the gold standard of excellence in the business. Normally, a wrestler had to demonstrate unmatched skill or strong personal connections to be invited. Sid, on the other hand, offered muscle and intimidation. As the enforcer, he didn't have to deliver graceful moves or technical masterclasses. He just had to be the biggest threat in the ring. This status jump was massive. Being in the same faction as Flair gave him credibility and exposed him to main event slots, including a match against Sting for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship at Halloween Havoc 1990. Although he didn't win the title, the fact that he was put in that position indicated how highly management valued him. Yet behind the scenes, Sid was already looking at WWF. Money had always been his priority, and Vince McMahon's promotion was known for bigger paychecks and a more national stage. Sid's decisions were rarely guided by sentiment. If WWF offered more, he'd leave even if he had just joined wrestling's most legendary faction. True to his practical approach, Sid jumped to the WWF by 1991. Rebranded as Sid Justice, he debuted as a special guest referee at SummerSlam. The company positioned him as a towering hero, aligned with Hulk Hogan. On paper, it made sense, a giant enforcer standing next to the ultimate babyface. But visually and temperamentally, Sid didn't look like the squeaky clean good guy fans were used to. One glance at his scowling face, and you could sense the villain beneath. The audience soon detected that mismatch. At the 1992 Royal Rumble, Sid eliminated Hogan in a way that felt more like a villainous move than a friendly rivalry. The crowd's reaction was immediate and fierce. They wanted Sid as the bad guy. This set up a final clash with Hogan at WrestleMania main event that disappointed fans who had hoped to see Hogan versus Ric Flair. Sid may not have been the marquee name fans dreamed of, but the match went forward. It was a typical Hogan-era main event, heavy on spectacle and lighter on technical prowess. Then came the infamous botched finish. Hogan hit his leg drop, Sid seemed to kick out at the last second, and the referee still counted 3. The confusion left the crowd puzzled. Backstage, things were even more convoluted. Sid had failed a drug test around that time. Yet the WWF didn't suspend him until after the lucrative WrestleMania and a European tour. The moment the tour wrapped, Sid stunned everyone by walking away from the company, opting to play softball and avoid his suspension. Most wrestlers would die for a stable main event spot, but Sid felt no loyalty to a business he never truly loved. A bar brawl with scissors, and a future champion soaked in blood. You'll never see it coming. By 1993, Sid was back in WCW. This time, he arrived in style as the mystery client of manager Colonel Robert Parker. Teaming with the monstrous Big Van Vader, he formed the masters of the powerbomb. They were unstoppable, flattening opponents and drawing crowds. WCW had huge plans for Sid. Promotional footage was recorded to show him as the upcoming world champion, implying he would dethrone Vader at the annual Starrcade event. But what was shaping up to be Sid's crowning moment was derailed by one of wrestling's most shocking backstage incidents. During a European tour, Sid and longtime WCW stalwart Arn Anderson got into a heated argument. Accounts differ on who provoked whom, but after harsh words in a hotel bar, Sid knocked on Arn's hotel door to continue the confrontation. What started as a verbal spat turned into a bloody fight. In the frenzy, Sid and Arn used a pair of scissors as weapons. Anderson was stabbed multiple times, and Sid also suffered wounds. Other wrestlers intervened before anyone was fatally injured. Both men were rushed to medical care, ending up with horrific scars and, in Sid's case, a destroyed push. WCW management couldn't ignore an incident so brutal. They fired Sid, scrapped plans for him to win the title, and let Arn recover. If anyone doubted Sid's volatility before, this sealed the perception. You can do a lot of questionable things in wrestling, but stabbing a respected veteran is almost never forgiven lightly. One would think the scissors incident would permanently blacklist Sid from top promotions. However, wrestling has a peculiar moral code. If a star can bring in money, many transgressions get overlooked. Sure enough, Vince McMahon brought Sid back to the WWF in 1995 under a new persona, Sycho Sid. This new name embraced his backstage reputation. Gone was the attempt to portray him as a smiling hero. Instead, the WWF leaned into his unhinged persona. His ring music began with haunting screams, and the announcers built him up as a ticking time bomb. Initially, he was paired with Shawn Michaels. Sid served as Michaels' menacing bodyguard, standing menacingly at ringside. But the alliance soured, and Sid soon turned on Michaels, establishing himself as a top-level villain once again. Sid's feud with then WWF champion Diesel carried him into main event matches on pay-per-view. But within months, the storyline sputtered. Sid drifted to lesser feuds. By 1996, he vanished from WWF programming. It seemed another of his runs had ended abruptly. This time, though, it wasn't a stabbing or a drug test or even an injury. He simply felt the company had no clear creative direction for him, so he stepped away to, of course, play softball. Did you ever think a man who walked out for softball would return as the company's champion? It's about to happen. Soon after Sid's exit, the Ultimate Warrior returned to WWF, only to have a falling out with management again. That departure left a gap Vince McMahon desperately needed to fill, so he reached out to Sid. When Sid returned in mid-1996, fans reacted surprisingly well. Now, billed simply as Sid, he re-entered the main event scene, showing a renewed focus. He looked intense, cut fierce promos, and pinned opponents with ring-shaking power bombs. His big moment arrived at Survivor Series 1996 at Madison Square Garden, where he faced Shawn Michaels for the WWF Championship. Michaels was the golden boy, beloved by many. But on that night, the crowd in New York suddenly sided with Sid. When he dropped Michaels with a powerbomb, fans roared. He pinned Michaels for the 3 count, capturing his first WWF Championship. For a man who didn't love wrestling, it was a crowning achievement. But timing in wrestling can be cruel. The industry was inching toward the Attitude Era. Stars like Stone Cold Steve Austin were capturing the public's imagination. Sid's monstrous presence felt a bit stuck between eras, no longer the cartoonish giant from the 1980s, yet not the rebellious anti-hero that fans were gravitating toward in the late 1990s. Sid lost the title back to Michaels at the Royal Rumble in 1997. Soon after, Shawn Michaels delivered his infamous Lost Smile speech, surrendering the belt due to a supposed knee injury. This opened the door for Sid to recapture the championship by defeating Bret Hart on an episode of Raw. But once again, overshadowed by swirling storylines, he dropped the belt at WrestleMania 13 to The Undertaker, a match overshadowed by Bret Hart and Steve Austin's iconic submission bout. After leaving the WWF, Sid disappeared for a while, but in mid-1999, he surfaced in WCW once again, calling himself the Millennium Man. The concept tried to tap into the Y2K paranoia of the late 1990s and to emulate Bill Goldberg's undefeated streak. Fans initially enjoyed seeing Sid back. He was still massive and capable of convincingly crushing opponents. But WCW was in a downward spiral at the time. Ratings plummeted, creative direction shifted every month, and the roster was overcrowded with big names. Sid's push felt repetitive and somewhat forced. Even so, he managed to capture the WCW World Heavyweight Championship twice in 2000. Unfortunately for him, the company was already in its death throes. Title changes occurred so often that they lost meaning. Fans hardly had time to process who the champion was before the belt moved again. Sid's reigns felt like afterthoughts, a sad commentary on how chaotic WCW had become. One horrific moment forced a live broadcast to cut away, and the footage still makes fans cringe decades later. On January 14th, 2001, WCW held its Sin pay-per-view in Indianapolis. Sid was booked in a 4-way match for the World Heavyweight Championship. With the company struggling financially and creatively, they were desperate to create buzz. Sid, wanting to do something new, climbed to the second turnbuckle for a boot attempt. At over 300 pounds, it was a risky move. When he leapt forward, his landing angle was disastrous. He came crashing down with his entire weight on one leg, causing both his tibia and fibula to snap in a gruesome compound fracture. The cameras immediately cut away. But the sound of his leg breaking was sickening. Live spectators gasped, some turning away in horror. For Sid, it was unimaginable agony. A 6'9" man, usually unstoppable, lay on the mat with bone protruding. Wrestling or not, that kind of injury is very real and very severe. Medical staff rushed in. Sid was rushed to the hospital, needing multiple surgeries and a metal rod inserted into his leg. His in-ring career was effectively halted. Since WCW was on the verge of folding, Vince McMahon would buy it just 2 months later. Sid had few support systems in place. The people who might have looked after him were already trying to save their own jobs. The injury turned him into a cautionary tale. Sid had always delivered big boots and power bombs with ease, but that one moment taught everyone in the business that even unstoppable giants can fall hard. Miraculously, Sid managed to return for sporadic appearances in the wrestling world starting around 2004. The man who'd once shattered his leg in front of a live pay-per-view crowd stepped back between the ropes, albeit not as a full-time performer. The crowd still reacted with awe. Anytime he nailed someone with a powerbomb, fans roared in nostalgic admiration. Yet the question lingered among wrestling circles. How can a man who main-evented major shows, captured world titles in both WWF and WCW, never receive an invitation to the WWE Hall of Fame? After all, the Hall of Fame had welcomed in some wrestlers with less impressive resumes and even some with questionable personal histories. What made Sid different? Sid walked out on the WWF more than once, famously preferring softball to wrestling. He also found himself in that violent fight with Arn Anderson, which tarnished his reputation. WWE typically embraces the narrative of wrestlers having undying passion for the sport. Sid, in contrast, repeatedly stated he saw wrestling as just a paycheck. While Sid was physically dominant, his storylines rarely had that one must-see rivalry that would immortalize him. Vince McMahon was known to have mixed feelings about Sid. Sometimes, promoters simply play favorites based on loyalty. Regardless, fans still remember him for his iconic look, his brutal finishing maneuvers, and that unforgettable meltdown in the ring with a shattered leg. Sid's legacy is complicated. On one hand, he was living proof that a towering height, imposing muscle, and intense stares can propel a person straight to the top of the wrestling card sometimes, with minimal attention to technique. On the other hand, he repeatedly walked away when it suited him, never fully committing to the business in the way so many others did. That pragmatic mindset had its benefits. When the wrestling industry exploited performers, pushing them to the breaking point, Sid was rarely a victim. He took the highest bidder, kept a healthy perspective, and walked away when the stress didn't match the paycheck. He also proved to be a cunning negotiator. Promoters, desperate for his star power, often gave him favorable deals. Even after major controversies, the door always seemed open if he chose to step back in. But that same attitude might have ultimately cost him the deeper admiration of wrestling's inner circle. The mythos of wrestling glorifies athletes who live and breathe the sport. Sid saw it as a job. There was no long childhood dream, no heartbreak over leaving, and no illusions about its brutality. He was always honest. If something better comes along, I'm gone. Sid's life came to a close on August 26, 2024, when he died from cancer at age 63. Unlike many wrestling legends who pass away suddenly or under tragic circumstances, Sid's final years were relatively quiet. He occasionally gave interviews reflecting on his tumultuous run. In those interviews, he made peace with some controversies, but stayed unapologetic about his business-first philosophy. True to form, he didn't dwell on regrets about not receiving a Hall of Fame ring or not delivering more five-star matches. He was content with the choices that led him to secure his own financial future and maintain a relatively healthy post-wrestling lifestyle, apart from the challenges introduced by that gruesome leg injury. WWE has yet to induct him into its Hall of Fame. Will it ever happen posthumously? Wrestling fans know the door is never truly closed. Promotions often rewrite their own histories. If some future storyline or marketing angle benefits from celebrating Sid as a legend, it could happen. But, so far, there's been silence. His story speaks volumes about what truly drives certain wrestlers. Many see it as a lifelong calling, sacrificing everything for a brief spotlight. Sid was never that guy. Yet, he reached the top of the mountain multiple times, only to move on at will. His ring name changed from Lord Humongous to Sid Vicious to Sid Justice to Sycho Sid, but the real constant was always his size, presence, and willingness to see wrestling for what it was, a business transaction. In an industry built on spectacle and showmanship, Sid's impact lay in his raw intimidation factor and straightforward approach to each match. Whether fans cheered him or booed him, they always reacted. His finishing move, the powerbomb, looked devastating and brought many wrestlers to an abrupt end in matches. For those who analyze careers by the numbers, Sid's record is impressive. Two-time WWF champion, two-time WCW World Heavyweight Champion, multiple WrestleMania main events, a consistent presence whenever he chose to show up. Yet the intangible qualities like ring psychology, skilled depth, and consistent top-level feuds are debated. Some fans remember him as a towering figure who terrified them. Others recall comedic promo slip-ups and abrupt no-shows. He is both revered for capturing big titles and scorned for never fully committing to the craft. None of that can erase the visual of him lying on the mat in 2001, leg-twisted, shock spreading across his face, or the memory of him slamming Shawn Michaels to the mat in Madison Square Garden to win his first WWF championship. The extremes of Sid's career can be jaw-dropping both in success and tragedy. If you were a casual wrestling fan in the 1990s, you'd see a giant who was sometimes unstoppable, sometimes awkward, and always imposing. If you were a die-hard insider, you'd probably know Sid's run-ins with management, the scissor fight, the drug test fiascos, and his repeated returns to softball. He was an enigma, in that sense, occupying a top spot while seeming uncommitted. Yet something about him continues to fascinate wrestling enthusiasts. Maybe it's his unpredictability. Maybe it's the simple fact that at 6 feet 9 inches and over 300 pounds, he commanded attention. Or perhaps it's the sheer brazenness of a man who never hid the fact that he was in wrestling to make money and little else. Professional wrestling is filled with characters who embody unwavering dedication. Sid Eudy wasn't one of them. His life and career underscored the sport's realities, how the biggest can rise fast, how swiftly they can fall, and how personal choices can either build or destroy a legacy. Sid made choices his own way. If the offer was right, he took it. If the situation felt off, he walked. While some see that as a betrayal of the wrestling ethos, others might quietly admire how he navigated a tough industry on his own terms. And so, the man who never cared about collecting action figures or memorizing wrestlers' finishing moves still managed to become a central figure during an era bridging the late 1980s and early 2000s. At times, he was the unstoppable monster with the belt around his waist. At other times, he was the outcast who was fired for a violent altercation. In one breath, he was a champion. In the next, he was at home, playing softball while the locker room seethed over his lack of commitment. His story is a testament to wrestling's dual nature. It rewards spectacle, but it's also a cutthroat business. Sid Eudy embodied both the mesmerizing showman who could fill arenas with tension and the ruthless pragmatist who walked away whenever he chose. Despite achieving so much, he remained an outsider, a cautionary tale, and an awe-inspiring presence all at once. In the end, Sid's life ended quietly, far from the roar of crowds, leaving behind a wrestling legacy unlike any other. It's the story of a man who climbed to the top by harnessing his natural gifts, tore through rivalries and controversies, and lived by his own code, a code that continues to confound, fascinate, and polarize wrestling fans to this day. Sid Eudy may never be hailed as the greatest technical wrestler, and the Hall of Fame might remain out of reach. Yet his size, his presence, and his ability to capture the spotlight made him unforgettable. Even after all these years, and even after his passing from cancer on August 26, 2024, at the age of 63, one thing is clear. Sid left a giant footprint on wrestling's canvas, one that won't be erased anytime soon.